I'm getting distracted. Welcome everyone to our first Fall Falcon session. So these are our Friday afternoon get-togethers with instructors, educators, library science scholars to exchange ideas on ungrading, upgrading, and beyond, and creative ways of engaging students. And this group that will be presenting has done the summer NIST experience, collected ideas, shared ideas on the basis of grading and helping students improve through feedback and through different assessments. So today we have is this the self-proclaimed Pacific Ungrading Group?
That's
West
our
is best
title.
I love that.
Yeah,
And I'm excited to hear from you, and I think our group will really appreciate what you have to share.
okay.
Welcome.
Thank you. Miriam, do you want to control the board and I'll just yell out slide when?
Yep, exactly. All right, can you see it okay?
Yeah, that's great. I'm just going to keep my other one open so I can just check. So welcome to our presentation, which we put together in a very last minute way. We are, as mentioned, our group was called the Pacific Grading Group. So we all got emails about the Solve My Problem series from NIST, the Addressing Challenges in Teaching. This was the third annual event. They compressed it into 3 weeks, which made it challenging in some ways. Basically, you chose a particular topic that you're interested in exploring further, and it could have been inclusivity and student mental health and all different things, and we all picked grading as our topic. Can we have the next slide? Okay, and so I would like to also acknowledge, so Miriam and Rachel and I are here, but there were other people who contributed to our work, and Mika and Mary were very active and, contributing members. They just unfortunately weren't able to attend today. And I specifically want to acknowledge Heidi's amazing facilitation. I would call her an excellent example of what you might call unobtrusive leadership, because she was there. She'd throw in a prompt here and there as it was needed. She never told us what to do or tried to push in one way or the other, but she was kind of like always there. And she was an excellent facilitator. So if you have any interactions with her, please, please know that she's amazing. Could I have the next slide? Thanks. And so the way the process worked this time, and I imagine it's very similar if you've been through one, we received emails, we signed up, and then there was an introduction meeting on July 6th, if I remember correctly. They introduced you to the people involved. They told you a little bit about the whole process, what was going to happen. They had already divided us into groups and obtained sort of facilitation. And then we met as a group. And we threw around ideas. What are we most concerned about? What would we really like to address? We had 6 meetings over a 3-week period in which we continued to develop, we've defined our problem. Let's do a literature search. Okay, now let's look through articles. Which techniques do we want to focus on? There was lots of chatting too about things we'd done. I've tried this, I've tried that. This works, that doesn't. And so there was lots of experience and information in the group. So it was pretty intensive, and some of us even had medical procedures during that time. I don't mean myself, and still soldiered on through, and were amazing. And then finally, we put together a poster, and the poster kind of outlined the problem, how we went about solving it, some of the things that we shared individually, our literature review annotated, some of the techniques we wanted to share and other resources we wanted to share. With links to other shareable resources. So if anybody is interested in, for example, like our literature page with all the papers and things, you're, I think, quite welcome to have that. And then the final July 27th, we had a final meeting where there was sort of presentation of the posters and a little bit of interaction between the groups, which I think we all would have, I would have liked to have been able to go and talk to all the different group members or heard more of a presentation. I think we might agree on that. But overall, very interesting, useful process. Could I have the next slide? Okay, and so for our grading group, we went through a lot of, you know, different things that we're concerned about regarding grading, but I think, you know, fairly quickly we centered in on the idea that, you know, there's this one thing that's always so frustrating. Like we assess our students and we give them points, but we don't want them to focus on those points. What we want them to do is to think about the learning and to think in more depth about the material and to not fuss about a half point, but instead to really focus on their learning. And so we talked a little bit about that, and we talked about, let me just check, yeah. And we talked about sort of what would have students focus more on the actual learning process. And so we thought, you know, a greater sense of agency, less idea that some grade is being showered on you from above and that you don't have anything to do with it. And it's just, you know, about the points, but, you know, having some actual stake and active control over some parts of it. Buy-in, which I'll talk about in a second, and then more metacognition, more student awareness of the way they learn and what their process of learning looks like, ways of reflecting on their own learning and then seeing what works and what doesn't, and then, you know, working through that. What we found, we talked a lot about buy-in the first meeting, and then we discovered that in the literature, there's no super clear, unambiguous definition of buy-in. And so I thought at this point, I would just ask, you know, maybe a few people to comment in the chat, if you like. When you think of the term buy-in, what one or two words comes to your mind? If we're thinking about students in particular. Trust, engagement and commitment, motivation, agreement, benefit of the doubt, willingness to participate, worth knowing, enthusiasm, ownership, engage. Yeah, this is awesome. Yeah, good, participation. So we came up with something that somewhat encompasses most of these things. And this is just my remembrance of it. So if Rachel and Miriam have something to add, that would be awesome too, in case I'm not getting everything. But the idea is for them to be engaged, for them to believe that the material they're learning is important enough to pay attention to and to work on, to trust that they will be able to accomplish it, given, you know, whatever the learning activities are, but also a willingness to persist when things are a little bit confusing or difficult. And the reason for that is that learning is not easy and learning is not comfortable and smooth all the time. If your process through a course is smooth and easy, you're not learning very much, really. There's always that confusion. There's always that little bit of chaos that you have to work through. And so if students are not willing to persist, then, you know, you've kind of lost the idea of buy-in. Okay, so can we have the next slide, please?
Okay, so next we're going to have you all contribute some of your expertise and know-how and what you've experimented with to talk about how do you get your students engaged in their learning, not the grade, right? So we're all frustrated by this real fixation on the points, but the points are not the point. So how do you personally get your students engaged in their learning? And so we're going to use Jamboard. I'm putting the link in the chat right now. If you click on it, you'll be able to take a sticky note, type an idea on it, save it, and then it'll post to the board. And please put a few if you have a few things to share. I'll move them around a little bit and try to organize them, and then we'll come back and talk about them a little bit. So the way you add a sticky note, if you look on the left, go to this little icon here, click on sticky note, and say, I like to hand out donuts. to the loudest person. That's a joke, but then, click save, and then the note will appear onto our beautiful green background. We have so many ideas. I think we're making a lot of jam here. Okay, so we have so many good things. I think we did not anticipate how many great answers you would have, and also how many people would be here. So
I want to know about the pointless puzzles.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. So by pointless, I assume you mean you don't get any score for it, but of course there's some pedagogical value to it.
Okay, good.
So we have some themes emerging here, right? So tell them why we are doing what we are doing. Make the assessment authentic. Use real life applications. Explain to them how it will help them meet their goals, not just our goals, but their goals, right? Making it personal, making connections to real life, whatever that means, right? If you're teaching microbiology, maybe that's disease, right? If they're going to go out into an engineering, maybe it's about the experience of building a bridge. We also have ways of organizing the class, of working in groups. We have grading structures, lots of opportunities at low stakes, lots of formative assessments. You're getting that feedback. We're emphasizing the process of learning, right? Not the points that would come into a summative assessment. We also have some over here with the iClicker questions with increasing difficulty, right? So if we want them to focus on thinking, let's have them do some thinking, beyond the memorization, beyond just being able to spit it back to us on an exam. We've got some other ways of engaging. We've got pull everywhere, providing rubrics, making your expectations very clear. That's going to improve the inclusivity of your course as well, right? So if we have first-gen learners, making the expectations very explicit. So it is one busy Jamboard. There's a lot to absorb. Thank you all so much for all your terrific ideas. I'm going to come back here and look at it, and we'll make sure that you guys can, of course, you can always access this link and come back and have a look. So thank you all for contributing to that. So our group had to focus a little bit, and we had a little trouble with this because, of course, grading is such a huge, massive topic. But we thought ways to get students engaged could be accomplished in these three ways. These are what we focused on. Giving the students increased agency, so a little more control, a little more say in the assessment in some way. Increasing the student buy-in. So Kathleen nicely had you all explain what you think buy-in means. And I think we talked about, it means trust, right? It means they believe that what we're doing is important. They're engaged, right? All of that is going to be important for learning, because learning is hard work. We need them to persist. And then also providing opportunities for metacognition. So letting them think about, how do we learn what we know? How can we become better learners in the future? And all of this in the context of assessments. So we sort of We did a lot of digging and I'm going to share our resource sheet at the end. And it's just sort of like, what we found in just 3 weeks. And we kind of organized some that we thought were particularly exciting or we kept seeing over and over in the literature. And we put them into a time frame relative to an exam, let's say. So pre-exam, before the exam, during, and then afterward. And so we're going to actually split out between the 3 of us. Kathleen's going to tell you about some of our pre-exam approaches. I'll be describing a few during exam approaches, and then Rachel will cover the post-exam approaches. We just want to make it very clear, this is not all inclusive. So this is just a sampling, but these are things that kind of called to us when we were doing our exploration. So over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you. Okay, so these were the 3, as Miriam said, techniques that sort of jumped out for us. And so I'm going to do them basically in the order, but I really want to focus on public exams because the concept was really new to me. I think it was new to not everyone in our group, but most. And so I'm kind of, the new shiny bauble. I'm very excited about it. So I'll spend a little more time talking about that. But we'll start with classroom assessment techniques. So basically this means you bring a lot of your assessments sort of into the classroom in a formative way. Quick, short, low stakes formative work, say prior to, a higher stakes exam or something like that. And then this allows you to provide feedback on student learning, and it's thought to increase engagement. It's got some metacognitive benefits. The students have a better understanding of their responsibility for their learning. And under instructor feedback, I think importantly, there is a connection with the students because you're providing them regular feedback. And it's relatively easy to implement. So the top 4 that I'm thinking of and that you will find described very nicely in this paper here, the Hansen and Florestano paper, are the 1-minute paper at the end of a class. In 1 minute, sort of either answer this question or summarize the most important points or something like that. The muddiest point, what was the hardest thing to understand in today's lecture or today's classroom activities or today's lab exercise, and why did you find it difficult and how can we help you, trying to identify preconceptions or misconceptions with even a few simple true-false clicker questions or multiple choice questions of some kind. And one that I have never used, but I have heard about is the 1-sentence summary. So summarize the entire class in a single sentence, or this section of the class, So you can see they're quick, right? You can run through them really fairly quickly. But the downside is that if you have a class of 800 students, providing them individual feedback on a regular basis is not going to be very easy, right? So it depends on the format you choose. If it's clicker questions in the classroom, that's fine. That's going to be all right. They'll get their feedback, but it won't be personalized or individualized. It's interesting because if you read through the papers, it turns out that there's not a lot of evidence that it impacts student performance. And you do need to plan the activities carefully. You want to make sure they're well aligned with course goals, right? When I first started using clickers, sometimes I wanted to put a clicker question in because it felt like it was time for one, but I realized I wasn't really assessing an important course learning outcome. So I had to stop myself from throwing clicker questions in there everywhere. However, given all those negatives, I think back to the benefits, even if it's not enhancing student performance, you are making a connection with your students. And that in itself could be worth the time, depending, of course, on whether you've got 50, 20, or 3,000 students in your class, right? This is a really good book here. It's 450 pages long, but you can download it for free. And it lists all different kinds of these activities, and it summarizes kind of how they work, and it provides case studies and examples and stuff. It's a very good resource. Under rubric consensus, this encompasses a lot of different things, from having a rubric and providing it to students in advance, to soliciting their feedback on that rubric questions for clarification, or do, this seems really too difficult, or, whatever the feedback happens to be, to having them co-create different portions of a rubric given the learning outcomes, to kind of building the rubric as you work through a project or some sort of activity. And so there, providing a rubric, even if all you do is provide it, there's a clarity of expectations. And that's very helpful, especially to someone like me, who was the first person in their immediate family to graduate from high school, never mind come to university. And so not understanding those actual expectations, was a bit of a stumbling block, especially at the beginning. And especially back then, it was cheating if you told anybody what the expectations were. You were supposed to psychically know. If students participate in the building of of the rubric, there's a sense of agency, and there is some evidence, it's not strong, that self-regulated learning is improved. So they take more control of their own learning. There's a metacognitive benefit there. And this paper was the one I thought had the best design of the study. The sample size was small and it was done over a single semester. So they only found a significant improvement in self-regulated learning via one measure. But even so, there was some improvement. It's extra time for sure, because you need to provide the rubric, you need to collect back, you need to oversee what the students are doing and make sure they're not kind of off on the wrong track and so on. And the evidence doesn't consistently suggest that there's an improved performance. And I think, we're talking about not having the students focus so much on points, but we're still really worried that they're not getting more points. And I really think that by giving students more sense of agency, more sense of control over their own learning, more understanding of the expectations, even if you're not changing the number they get in the class, you're changing the experience they have in the class. And so for that reason, it could be valuable. And this is a presentation at a teaching and learning center that has, it just has some examples of different ways you can approach it, and kind of how it works. I found it to be useful. Okay, I want to, can we go to the next slide? Because I want to talk about public exams. So in public exams, the idea is that you provide before an exam partial information about an exam. That means they may see the questions, but not what the possible answers are. Or they may see part of the question with some key pieces of information left out. Or they may see a figure, but not the exact question you're going to ask about it. Or part of the figure, but not the whole figure. So what you're doing is you're focusing attention on the concepts and the activities they're going to be doing during the exam, without just letting them go look up all the answers, right? And so these are the issues that the technique is meant to address. So for most of us, for me at least, the exam is a big surprise to the students, and they see it the first time when you plop it in front of them in a time-controlled, anxiety-ridden room. So there's a lot of anxiety and fear about that can affect performance. There can be a lack of trust. I cannot tell you how many times students say to me, do we have to memorize the codon table? And I keep going, no, that's just a waste of time. Like, no. And the next day, the same student will ask, do we have to memorize the codon? Because they don't trust that you're telling them the truth about what's going to be on your exam, right? Sometimes the way you word things or the way you structure things can be confusing for students. This is especially true maybe for when there's a language issue, but that's not the only reason why there could be some confusion. I find as I get older, the way I phrase things is not so comprehensible to younger people, right? So there's a large amount, if you give them big blocks of stuff to read and then answer questions, they have to read and digest that, right? And then because of those things, there's often a pressure to just test people on memory, not clicker, but multiple choice questions or simpler things that are just memory work. And we don't really want that either. So the aim of the pre-release of partial information is to reduce the anxiety and increase the trust. So here's part of, maybe not your whole exam, but here's the first half of the exam, what it's going to look like and the kinds of things you're going to be asked. It can head off misunderstandings due to language and other issues, because I'll talk about that in a minute. And if there's big blocks of explanation or big figures to look at and interpret, they can see those in advance, so they've actually seen them, and then they can answer the actual questions. And the idea is you can deepen the thought. You've given them that pre-exposure, so now you can ask them deeper, more detailed thinking kinds of questions. You don't have to have them just spew back memorized stuff. And you can focus attention on core concepts. Like I tend to teach lots of different things, some of which I never plan to test them on. And, it makes more sense really to let them know, what are they going to be tested on. Can I have the next slide? So this is basically how it's done. There's partial exam information that's released to the students in advance. They have an opportunity to read through. They can see very quickly that they're not getting complete information. In my case, I'd leave out the names of the actual genes or something, or I'd leave out, some piece of data or something like that. But they have some sense of, what kind of questions. If they find the wording unclear, are you asking this or are you asking that? They have an opportunity to contact the instructor and provide that feedback. And they have time to think carefully. If I show them a picture of a construct with, with a plasmid and an insert and stuff like that, and I say, I'm going to ask you questions about, I don't know how you'd express, they're going to look down and they're going to try to think about how you would do that with that vector, and so on. So you can actually then start probing deeper into their understanding. The instructor then collects the feedback and comments. There should be a time limit on that. You can make edits for clarity. And in some cases, I've heard people will do another round of this, which just to me is too time consuming. But then when the students actually get the information, get the exam, they see the completed exam and it's been edited for clarity. And there's, less issues with comprehension of the question. If people don't understand what you're asking, then and they don't answer it properly, then that's not really testing whether they knew the material. It's testing whether they understood what you wrote, right? Can I have the next slide? I just want to show a quick example of what we're talking about, just to make it, because I may not have been super clear. So this is a traditional question that I would ask, say, in a genetics class, which is, here's an RNA sequence, and then here's one with a mutation. And then, tell me what kind of mutation is, and then tell me, something about the protein function. Is this protein going to work or not? What kind of effect do you expect? A strong effect or a weak effect, and so on. Could I have the next one? This is an example of a public exam type question. And basically it shows the same two sequences, and then it points out there's going to be additional sequences. And then it just says, tell me which one is most likely to be closest to the wild type. Tell me one which is going to be least like the wild type, the most or the least normal function. And then make sure you can explain your reasoning by telling me the exact effect on all those three different proteins based on these DNA sequence or RNA sequence changes. And so that's an example of something that they would see in advance. And so they don't know what those sequences are, but they know they're going to have to be thinking about how translation works and what the codon table tells them, etc. Can I have the next slide?
Kathleen, actually, Neil has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Hi. I mean, I like the concept. I guess one of the questions would be, can you hear me? You can?
Yes.
You can, okay. So is there any concern at all that by priming them with the question phenotype, I mean, examples of how questions are phrased for sure, but the content, could you be then limiting how, I mean, I know from my PharmD students, if I told them that I'm going to be just exploring these things in the exam, they wouldn't study anything but the one thing that you tell them that's going to be the best.
Yeah, and
right?
that's
you run the risk of limiting them having a broad understanding of everything that you've been instructing them on.
Yeah, that's very true. I have thought about that too. But one thing that I've been thinking about, because I think I'm going to try this the next time I have control over exams in a course. But I think what I would do is I would just give them some sample questions. I wouldn't necessarily give them the whole exam, because I think you could say, here's the different, here's a sampling of some of my shorter questions. Here's a sampling of like one of the two longer questions or something like that. So that still encourages them to prepare for the rest of the material, but with a better understanding of the kinds of things they're going to be asked to do. Yeah. I mean, I'm not by any means claiming this is a perfect thing. It's just, it's sort of interesting. And I think that it could be tweaked, at least for my purposes. Maybe not exactly as written in the paper, which I will point out has not been peer reviewed yet.
I'll just add too that I think another way you can get around that issue is you can do public exams perhaps for your midterms, but then you could do a cumulative exam, a final exam in which there is no public exam structure. And so then you are requiring they have that broad understanding, but you have primed them with your personal question writing style and expectations throughout the course of the semester. So they are very, very prepared for that comprehensive and cumulative final exam.
So would you say then, like, so for example, in the kinds of classes that we do, I tend to do modeling of the exam phenotype throughout as poll everywhere type style questions. So that'd be kind of an example of like the open exam or public exam, where throughout each class you're asking them exam styled questions that are on the topic so that they can see how you style your exam writing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's a great idea.
I've done that in some of my courses too, like at the end of the lecture. Here's 2 example exam questions.
I would say, can I just add one little thing? What's nice about formally handing them some kind of, scaffold of what the exam will look like is you get feedback on it. So with your poll everywhere, maybe you're also getting some feedback based off how they do, right? But you can get really good feedback on the language of it, right? That's
yeah,
very
you
helpful.
get real-time corrections if you've made a faux pas on the.
That's true. That's true.
If this reference here is actually a workshop that was done presenting the technique, and there's a lot of examples, and they actually show some of the kinds of wording changes that they made based on feedback, and some of them you would never have guessed that was a confusing phrase or whatever, and so that part of it's kind of interesting. Yeah. So let's just zip to the next slide. And then this just shows you what they actually get on the exam. So there's pieces of information that are added, but the rest of the structure of the question is fairly similar. And I have been looking at the way I ask certain questions on my exams. They're not adaptable quite in this way. I would have to really work to modify them. Next slide. Okay, so the caveats, like I don't know how other people operate, but sometimes something happens a couple of classes before an exam that we end up talking about in the class, and there's a lot of input, and I want to put that on my exam. So I don't want to have the complete exam ready maybe 2 weeks ahead, because I tend to slow up or slow down or speed up depending on the pace of the class. I want to make sure that the exam covers what I actually cover in the class. So there's prep time, and there's a lot of time spent reading feedback and then making edits and so on. There is no published evidence of this being effective for student learning. There is the one paper by the Wiggins group, but it's not peer reviewed. And so we're interested, and I had this prompt here for questions or comments, but I think we're getting them already. So, and I'm very concerned about our time. So maybe I should be passing this on to Miriam at this point.
All right, baton accepted.
Okay.
So that's all set up, right? That's leading up into the exam. And so we're going to then focus on a couple of 3 things that you can think about for during the exam. I'll start with the one at the bottom, so which is the design of the actual question itself. If we're trying to promote engagement and thinking on a level that will be useful to them outside of the college classroom, right? We want to be writing questions that are higher order, right? So we want to have them up in the applications and the analysis and the evaluation and the creation as much as possible. There are constraints on this, but it is possible to make, highly engaging, very thoughtful questions, even in multiple choice. So of course, it takes time though. It takes time to learn how to write those questions. It takes some time to refine those questions, and we're always having to create new ones. Here again, I think feedback is really important. You know, if you can get feedback from your students, if you're doing, you know, right, the exam format we just talked about, or I have learning assistants. And so I have them take the questions, and then I get a sense of, is this doable? How's the language and so on? And I create a larger and larger pool of quality questions. The next aspect is the environment that you create, either with your physical space, with the actual exam format that you're providing. So is it online? Is it paper? Can they sing a poem? You know, what is the format of your exam? And is that inclusive to students of all kinds that speak different languages, that might have physical disabilities, that might be anxious, and so on? So the benefits of providing an inclusive exam and environment are that you're going to have more success from your students because they have the feeling that they belong there, right? They have been taken into account in this high stakes assessment that usually makes up a good portion of their grade. There's more learning that's possible when you kind of expand your own questions to take into account a more inclusive application, right? Making an exam more authentic to a broader set maybe of professions and individuals, and making a more respectful environment. So you see them, right? And then hopefully they see the work that you've put into it. So of course, you know, any investment you make in your pedagogy is going to take a little more time and also some skill. So some of the examples that I was looking at, see, let me open this up here a little bit. Right, so I've spent a lot of time trying to make my exams really accessible and welcoming and inclusive by making sure that I de-gender whatever I can. I try to make my questions reflect a broader group of people. And then I have all my learning assistants take my exams to make sure the English is accessible, that someone who's a non-English speaker, I'm not catching them accidentally, right? And then as far as the format goes, right? So during COVID, we flipped online, and immediately our exams became inaccessible to students who didn't have technology, right? That was easy to use, that they didn't have reliable access to the internet. In the classroom, you might have this beautifully written short answer question that someone who can't physically write easily will struggle with, right? And so thinking about the time that it takes for them to read your question, if they have dyslexia, if they have some kind of challenge, and then the time it'll take for them to physically write it out, right? So there's a lot to balance there, but it's worth investing in. And of course, over time, you get a larger pool of questions that will work well for more of the people. And how will you know if it's working, right? Getting feedback from the students, right? So on every exam, for example, I have a page where they can write down any question that was ambiguous. Was there something where it seemed like there were multiple answers? Was there some language that confused you? And I look at that when I'm making the final key for the exam, and I take it into account and I let them know about it, right? So a lot of you you found this example where I had this multiple answers possible. So I accepted both answers, right? You can adjust to it in real time and give them more agency in the classroom. They're giving me feedback on my exam and I'm responding in real time. Also, surveys are very good, right? So have a mid-quarter survey and ask them, you know, after that exam, maybe, were there any challenges? So then finally, I want to focus on just for a minute on two-stage exams. I absolutely love this exam format. I've been doing it since 2017. And it's fantastic. So the students will take the exam in two stages. First, entirely on their own, they turn in their exam form. I give them out then a group exam form, and they work in groups. And those are mostly the same questions that they get to discuss then. And so by the time they leave my classroom, they know probably what the right answer is. They do 20% better on the questions after a discussion with the group. And they know how other people studied for it, what kind of facts they brought to bear on that particular question. And they're socializing. And there are lots of other published benefits from it. So let me go forward and talk a little bit about it. Collaborative assessment generally first. So would you, actually, in the interest of time, I'm sorry, I think we're going to have to skip this. Sorry. But what are some of the benefits of a collaborative assessment? Well, we learn socially, right? That's how we construct knowledge, is through discussion and in a social context. And here, I think they can learn from assessments. They should not be just about measuring. There should be a learning experience as well. They get feedback on their mental models in real time from their peers. Collaboration is something they need to practice. So if you look at surveys of what skills employers are looking for, it's the top 1 or 2 now all the time. Can they collaborate? And if you have a class where you want them to collaborate, turn to your neighbors and discuss this, solve this problem together. Having the assessment be collaborative just kind of pulls it all together. It motivates learning how to do it well earlier in the class. There's also exciting research showing that, ironically, knowing they're going to get to work with their friends, their classmates, a lot of them say it reduces their anxiety. You have to be careful there because for some of them, it can be increasing their anxiety if they're worried about finding a group in particular. That's what I hear the most about. And then there is data that it can result in better learning and retention. So we have the 2 stages, the individual stage, and then the group stage. So this is how I run it. I have them form groups of 4 as they're coming into the exam. Now, does it mean that some folks who are used to working together have increased possibility maybe of cheating on the individual? Maybe. I haven't run any statistics, and I'm not so worried about it, actually. We proctor and so on, but I have them sit so that then after they've taken the individual exam and they've turned it in, they can immediately turn to their neighbors and start to work with their neighbors. This is where the classroom can have a huge impact on the experience. Most of my classes are 500 to 700 students. They're in stadium seating, fixed. Recently, we have a new teaching complex that has chairs that pivot. It's amazing how exciting that is, right? Just the smallest thing, but the space does matter during assessment. So then they turn and they work on mostly those exact same questions. I take out the lower order questions and maybe give them a good solid something for the group to sink their teeth into. And they have the rest of the exam time to finish that. They turn in that form. Some people force consensus. There's seems to be the correlation that they learn more. You can measure more learning with the consensus, but it takes a lot of time. And because of my numbers, I let them do individual forms for that exam too. And then for grading, you have about 80% of it for the individual and about 20% for the group exam. That way it motivates studying hard on your own. You can't lean too hard on the group. Okay, so some of the challenges I think you can see are logistics, right? Handing out all those exams, pulling them all back in. And you do need to be cognizant of students with disabilities. Right. So it really helps that we have a proctoring center that is willing to entertain my crazy exam format. And so I have students with extra time show up early. So they come in early and they stay until the same time where they all start the group exam together. So if you have any questions, please just reach out. We'll provide our contact information. And I absolutely love this exam format and would be happy to spread some Kool-Aid. And if you want to look up, there's an introduction to it from the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative, QR code on the right. And then there's a meta-analysis where they went through all the studies, well, a lot of the studies that have been done on the 2-stage exam and sort of pulled together some best practices. And then over to Rachel.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to try to keep it really short, which is nice because I think the things I'm going to talk about are things that most of us are familiar with. They're not new concepts, but perhaps some of it that can be surprising is either lack of evidence or no evidence supporting them. So, but I can talk about that a little bit. So I'll start off with the third one, just like Miriam did. So with post-exam, we're really talking about reflection. So either reflecting on the exam itself and how they did, or reflecting on themselves in how they how they prepared for the exam and how they felt going into it and after it. So that third option is allowing them to revise and regrade. It gets some points back that they missed. And I personally think this is really powerful because it's, so much of the time students take exams and then they get their grade and that's it. They don't know what they did wrong. They don't even really know what they did right. Sometimes you think you nailed a question and you didn't. So I think it really allows them to revisit what they did well, what they didn't, and make sure they know where to brush up on better, especially if there are like cumulative finals and things like that. And so they're going to get greater proficiency, not only in the material, but also as they study, looking at those habits. It definitely can reduce test anxiety if they know they're going to be able to earn a percentage back. And I think this does hinge on, they can't earn all their points back, but they can get back, and you have total control what that looks like. Can they get 25% of the points of they missed back, half, whatever. Yeah, and so it can really be quite powerful, but that is taking on a lot as the instructor. You're having to grade everything twice. You could do peer grading. I would say that's the big takeaway from these post-exam strategies, is that they work really nicely together. And so it can be super helpful in that way. Yeah, so the one problem with this strategy is that higher performing students often will engage in this way and continue to get higher grades, whereas lower performing students may not participate. So there may be an equity issue or accessibility issue here and how usable that is. So I'm going to just bounce up to peer and self-assessment. So this is, providing structure so students can critique themselves and each other. Again, as Miriam was saying, we're social creatures. And so I think hearing your peer, not just instructor, provide feedback can be quite powerful. However, the big hinging point on this is that there has to be some amount of training or criteria or structure so that students are able to do this in an effective, kind, and meaningful manner. And so that can be additional load on you for that. So the last point I'm going to talk about is exam wrappers, which is these tools that are allowing students to, again, reflect on how they prepared and how they felt going into and out of the exam. And can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to show an example from this great paper of some, well, if you haven't used an exam wrapper, what it could look like. So, here we're asking, as you prepared, how much time did you put into these different, very common strategies? That's a good opportunity to be like, wow, I didn't even consider looking through textbook chapters. Hopefully that's not the case, but having to kind of self-reflect. When did you start studying? I think most students, but definitely instructors, know that cramming doesn't work. So how much time did you give yourself to prepare? Do you exclusively study as a group? Data also show that talking out loud, explaining things to someone else is an incredible way to learn things and remember it. I always tell my students that if you're not part of a group, or if that's not your comfort zone, please explain it to your dog or your cat or your parents or whoever. Just say it out loud because it reinforces it, etc. So this paper has other examples of it as well. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, so exam wrappers can be powerful, but there's a couple ways in which they are most effective. So there was this really great paper that saw that there was benefit with exam wrappers, but that positive effect really increased when it was being used across all of the students' courses that semester. So when they were seeing exam wrappers over and over again, they were having to reflect over and over again about their study habits and preparation habits, etc. That's what really gave a positive outcome for students. Also, there was a paper that talked about that had some of the best glowing results but they also acknowledged that it worked really well when the students had it built into their first year that they were taking a learning strategies course. There was a course built into it, and I don't know how many of us have that built into our programs. I'm about to enter my program as an assistant professor this spring and this coming spring, and I don't believe that that's something that we have. So that's an interesting idea that we should build that in if possible. And I don't know if that's possible to build into individual courses, but it perhaps is most effective and doable as a standalone course. And so I kind of mentioned before that these post-exam strategies work really, really well together. So they found that exam wrappers worked really well when it wasn't just self-examination, but peer and instructor feedback as well, having these conversations from different levels and different people. There's a really great paper that is in our resources that talked about how a really positive outcome of an exam prep or with an exam autopsy. So taking time in class to go through the exam step by step by step, talking about how to tackle the questions, not just the correct answers, but how to get to that correct answer. And that, I think, can really help students think about how they could better prepare and build those skills themselves to be able to identify how to tackle those questions. And then, of course, regrading, peer review, peer grading could also be really powerful combined with an exam wrapper. So that's something to really think about. That these exam wrappers can be helpful, but they can also be pretty superficial if we're not building in these other things with them to support them. Next slide. Okay, so we did have a lot of surprises. I'm just going to do a quick little summary of our experience and working through this. I think we've done a pretty good job of emphasizing that we wanted to find peer-reviewed support for these things, because as you all did a fantastic job on the Jamboard, we've heard about a lot of these things, we've implemented them, but is there actually data supporting that they are effective? And you know, it's difficult to find the time to analyze our own pedagogical data on whether or not our methods are working for our students more than just performance, right? So there is some, we've got a great list of resources for you all to look at, but there's not necessarily a ton of scientific literature on all of these. And they're not always very comparable studies as well, you know, particularly because a lot of the things that we're seeing are like from nursing and business school. So how well can we apply those things to our STEAM or STEM fields? And so there really is a need for more literature being produced out of those fields. One of the things we struggled with that we, you know, kind of open this up with is having a shared and sort of field specific or STEM specific definition of buy-in. You know, we all had a lot of different words in the chat that we all think about it, but what is a unifying one? And so I think that's something important to think about, is what can we all agree on what buy-in is, and therefore how can we increase it? I think that's pretty crucial as we move forward. And I think we have one more slide. Yes. Okay. So I definitely feel after this experience with this group that there are a lot of things I'm very excited about to incorporate into my own teaching. And hopefully you're feeling that same way. You're feeling like this could be something exciting to try, something entirely new. And there is data supporting everything we shared with you today to some degree, with an asterisk for public exams not being peer reviewed yet. However, we also acknowledge that with all of these, there is a cost, and most of that cost is coming from you as the instructor in terms of your time and effort to implement them effectively. And one thing I noticed particularly in those post-exam strategies is that quite often they're not equitable in that most of the students who are taking advantage of them are those that are already excelling in the course. So how do we create opportunities for all students, particularly those that are struggling, that need that opportunity to to better their scores, but also better their metacognitive abilities and learning strategies and study habits. And so lastly, just kind of building off of this idea of effort that, you know, as we all walk away from this, hopefully feeling excited, hopefully feeling like we have some new tools in our toolkit, it's always important to reflect that we can only be as good as of instructors as we can show up as. We can only put so much into these to still be effective and, you know, not be confused ourselves, not be exhausted, and not be overrun. And so we always have to be mindful of that balance for our personal well-being. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much for closing us out, Rachel.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing so many ideas, and the chat was full of really great activities, assessments, and considerations.
I forget, are we able to share the chat with the link for the recording?
Oh, that's a good question. I think we have been adding it somewhere.
I think I've saved them, and we can post them in our YouTube channel with the individual meetings. I was thinking how to do it with not everyone's names right there.
Well, thank you all for being so engaged and for your contributions to the chat. I'm still reading through it, trying to write my to-do list.
What a great start. Thank you for sharing all you did and all the collective knowledge that the team, both members presenting and the other contributors, shared.
And I'll just lastly say that this was a really incredible experience participating in the addressing challenges in teaching. We had such an incredible group. Everybody contributed. You know, we met a lot and we worked really hard, and everybody did so in a really equitable way. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity. And so if you're considering it next summer, I think all of us would highly, highly recommend it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was really a good use of 3 weeks, I would say.
Yeah, and our 2 group members were very disappointed. They couldn't, they had a time conflict with the
Yeah.
for this presentation.